Hi, it's Dustin Lanier. Thanks for listening. Please find me on LinkedIn for original public sector operations content every week. And please reach out to me if I and my team of procurement professionals at Civic Initiatives can help you be a public procurement change agent. So today I was going to talk to you about evaluation and negotiation and try to give you some practical guides. Not everything will work in every part of the country, but these are some things that I think are a different take. As a general way of introduction, we're going to talk about sources of power and acquisition. Where does the buyer have power? Where does the vendor have power? And understanding that, how do you flow that into the way that you negotiate? Understanding that obviously the foundation of success is a good solicitation. If you don't have a good solicitation, then your basis of being able to negotiate in the future is really hampered. How to think about setting up evaluation strategies in terms of the best ways to set up and think about things you would do within an evaluation. Fundamentals of negotiation, doing formal negotiations, and then I have a little scenario if we have time at the end. Sources of power and acquisition. So I'm going to reference this book 3 times because I heard this speaker 5 years ago, and his presentation really stuck with me. It's Patrick Henry Hansen, and so one of his first quotes I'm going to pull is that power is the single most important component in negotiation, even more important than the skill. The more power a negotiator has, the less relevant skills become. So we'll use that to bridge into a conversation about seller power, buyer power, and considering power in the approach to contracting. So the seller, where do they gain power in a conversation? Well, the first is they have a lot of knowledge and expertise. So they usually have a very high expertise and capacity in market segments of interest to the buyer. If they weren't, they probably wouldn't be on your list. So in addition to having very high expertise in a particular area, they also are very experienced in the sourcing process. So winners keep winning and may stay around forever. So they're very experienced at the process of actually dealing with contracting. Time, the seller cultivates the interest in the process. So the longer that you go in that process, the harder it is to come away from it without buying something, which is why the people who sell timeshares, for example, try to get you to come to a thing and they say, oh, it's only an hour, but now you've invested an hour. And so now it's the inclination to actually complete a thing. They have information, especially in a public sector situation. They can easily look up things like deadlines, they know urgency, budgets, and then so all of that summarizes to sellers' primary point of power is differentiation, that they can create competitive advantage in their products and capabilities that are unique to their company. And the more that they have the ability to create differentiation, the more that power shifts to them in a negotiation situation. So sources of public sector buying power, money, they have the money. The golden rule is that he who has the gold makes the rules. So that clearly is the ability to drive and dictate. They have their own ability to have time power, so they can create opportunities that influences the seller's investment in time and effort to where the seller is unlikely to walk away from a deal. Makes it very difficult for the seller to walk back. The buyer has options. They can stay in status quo. They can use a co-op to go get to a competitor. They can delay, either explain it or not display it. There's power in the process. So we're in a cone of silence. You can't talk to this kind of person. There's a designated point of contact. The point of contact can say, well, my boss says this, or the council says that, and you can't talk to them because I'm the designated point of contact. There's lots of ways that the process can create a great deal of power for the buyer. And ultimately, the buyer is trying to strive for commoditization. In order to context some of the rest of our conversation, it's important to realize that the most influenceable element of power is to be able to manage the reality or the perception of commoditization of the supplier service. The more that differentiation, which is the buyer source of power, is the heavier part of the weight, then the less negotiating power that you have in dealing with that vendor. And then the more that you have been able to create a level playing field that reduces unique advantage, or at least allows unique advantage to be taken within its appropriate shape, the more that you have created equivalent power. Generally, to create that power mix, it's accomplished through strong market research, understanding what you're going to market for, thoughtful requirements, a solicitation process that emphasizes competition, and an ongoing refinement of strategies in each category to increase competitive supply of sources in the future. If there's only one company that provides janitorial services in the city or county, what can we do in the future to try to drive some additional options or to try to create market segments? Maybe that ties into our DEI strategy. So there's a lot of aspects that we can take with that. That's just a general introduction to how to be thoughtful about where you can manage some of those power dynamics in the course of work. So the foundation of success is a good solicitation. Negotiation begins with the solicitation design. So solicitations must create enough competition so that we can be assured that market forces are going to drive success in later stages. One thing is to try to have the requirements we know, but also try to leave some space for the vendors to be able to demonstrate that they're the expert. Being cautious about hyper prescribing every aspect of the way that the vendor would provide solution, and trying to emphasize the outcomes and outputs that we expect to have in solutions. Weighing each mandatory requirement on its merit. Every time that we say a requirement is mandatory, recognize that that's an opportunity to exclude an offer for non-conformance that we have to be careful of. So making sure that we really are emphasizing the competitive characteristic of the solicitations. If there's things where maybe the requirements need to be worked out to some degree, there's several states that I've seen that have done multi-round solicitations that basically do an upfront minimum down select based on general qualifications and then with a secondary qualification round. So really thinking about how the solicitation is going to drive competition is super important. Also, this paragraph here, I think, should be in every RFP in some form or flavor, depending on how aggressive or conservative your lawyer core is. But the magic paragraph, the state reserves the right to waive certain requirements or add requirements consistent with the scope of the RFP if the state determines that best value would be achieved. You can also write that sentence, that paragraph a little softer by saying that we reserve the right to waive certain requirements if it was de minimis and it would have limited impact on the aspect of the solicitation. So I've been in multiple solicitations where one detail that was written that caused some particular flare up in the process that everyone had, when they saw the actual impact of that in the world, knew that it was impacting the ability to actually advance a particular RFP, but were stuck with the perception that that was going to cause some technical issue. Being able to have some ability to say, if best value is achieved by not starting over an RFP and taking another 9 months, I think that's a very important concept to include in documents if you're able to. So to build that good RFP design, we need to be able to conduct market analysis. What have peers done? What vendors are in the mix for other peers? And then developing clear requirements specifications that allows you to create a differentiation in scoring. So how are we going to score so that we actually get to an outcome? Maybe have them give a client use case where they show how their work is integrated and how they serve and how they emphasize the human piece. Take into account about the economic impact to your area. There's ways to add things to RFPs that will also be evaluated that create some differentiation so you don't stack 4 vendors at 92.4%. If you don't have multiple competitive responses, then your ability to negotiate goes to the floor. You have to think about and define these characteristics that are going to get people to respond. I also have a presentation I do on 5 things I wish I knew, what vendors should better understand about the buyer experience and buyers should understand about the vendor experience. And in that, I talk about that risk and cost are taken into account by vendors when they decide to respond to your solicitations. If you have not been on the private sector side and you haven't answered one of your own RFPs, I can tell you it's very time consuming, especially if you ask for a lot of things in a very custom way. So vendors will make an internal calculation about the likelihood of success. So especially if you have an existing vendor, it is really important that if vendors think that you're only bidding a particular situation because you have to, you may well end up in a situation where people choose to not bid because they think they can't win. So when vendors believe an incumbent or a well-positioned competitor has access to information that gives them undue advantage, they're not going to invest the time to respond, which directly limits competition and therefore your negotiating leverage. So consider how you level that playing field. Prior reports that were produced, different outputs from the program. I always advise having a section in RFPs, especially complex ones, that I call an environmental narrative, which is What is the reason for this project? Scope may say what the project is, but environmental narratives are very effective at saying, why are we doing this project? Which levels that informational playing field? Integration information. If you're bidding for a piece of software where there's an incumbent, being able to provide process maps or integration APIs or things that allow vendors to be able to feel like they will have an equal opportunity to bid, and not that only the vendor who is currently in has the only ability to access information, because that will directly affect the responses that you will receive. So that's just some things on how a good RFP and a thoughtful RFP creates some space for you to actually execute some of these evaluation and negotiation strategies.